Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Let's crack. Thank you, Jerry. Thanks, everybody. Thank you very much, Jerry. Well, I have been traveling around in conference, and the other day I was at the UN General Assembly in New York, and I was talking to the foreign minister of another country, and I won't say which one, since I must preserve my reputation for diplomacy, but let's just say that they have an economy about the size of Australia. They're getting smaller, alas. Plenty of snow, nuclear missiles, balalaikas, oligarchs, leader who strips to the waist. You get the picture. After a few tense exchanges, my counterpart gave a sigh and said that any difficulties in our relationship were all Britain's fault. It was you guys who imposed democracy on us in 1990, he said. And I was a bit startled by this, and I said, hang on, Sergei. Sorry. Aren't you in favor of democracy? And then I asked for a show of hands in the room. All those in favor of democracy, please show. And you would have thought that this was a bit like asking Maria von Trapp whether she was in favor of raindrops on roses and whiskers on kittens. And I'm proud to say that the entire UK side of the room raised their hands as one to show that democracy was indeed one of our favourite things. But much to my amazement, our opposite numbers just kept their hands on the table and gave us what we diplomats call the hairy eyeball. And of course it was in sense of a bit of fun. I was winding them up, and there was a sense in which my question was semi-satirical. But the exchange was also deeply serious and revealing about the way in which the world has changed, or perhaps the way in which it has failed to change, since that moment of exhilaration in 1990, when the Berlin Wall came down and the Soviet Union was coming to an end, and some of us, and I was certainly one, really believed that we had come to a moment of ideological resolution, and that after 7 frozen decades of communist totalitarian rule, the gulags, the oppression of Eastern Europe, all the things that have been conveniently forgotten by the Dave and Deirdre Sparts who were still singing Lenin's Red Flag last week at the Labour Party conference. We genuinely thought we were seeing the final triumph of that conglomerate of Western liberal values that unite the people in this room. Not just free markets, but all the things that we then believed in that brief shining moment at the end of the Cold War were the essential concomitants of free market capitalism: rule of law, human rights, independent judiciary, habeas corpus, equalities of race and gender and sexual orientation, the eternal and inalienable right of the media to make fun of politicians. We assumed, write poems about it. We assumed that this political freedom, social freedom, went hand in hand with economic freedom, like buying an ice cream Snickers bar. Only the free market could produce something as ingenious as an ice cream Snickers bar, and a copy of Private Eye, free speech of a kind still unknown in many parts of the world, in a 2-for-1 deal, like two sides of liberty's golden coin. And yet I have to tell you that both sides of that coin of freedom have been tarnished over the last 2 decades. And we must be humble and realistic enough to accept that in many eyes, the notion that we could endlessly expand the realm of liberal democracy was badly damaged, alas, by the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And symmetrically, our model of free market Anglo-Saxon capitalism as practiced in London and New York was seriously discredited by the crash of 2008 and the global suspicion of bankers. And we've taken those twin blows, like punches to the midriff, and I think we've been winded, and sometimes lacking in confidence in those ideals. And if you look at the course of events in the last 10 years, then I'm afraid you can make the case that it is partly as a result of that lack of Western self-confidence, political, military, economic, that in some material ways the world has got less safe, more dangerous, and more worrying. After a long post-war period in which the world was getting broadly more peaceful, the number of deaths in conflict has risen from 49,000 in 2010 to 167,000 last year. The global number of refugees is up by 30% on 2013, up to 46 million last year. And of course, much of that crisis in refugees can be attributed to the war in Syria. It is part of a wider arc of instability that sweeps across from Iraq to Libya. And this matters profoundly to our country because it is the continuing savagery of the Assad regime against the people of Aleppo and the complicity of the Russians in committing what are patently war crimes, bombing hospitals when they know they are hospitals and nothing but hospitals. That is making it impossible for peace negotiations to resume, and that is prolonging a migration crisis that last year overwhelmed Europe's ability to cope. And when the violent extremism of Daesh is erupting across the face of the Middle East, we are inevitably seeing the contagion spread to cities in Germany, France, Belgium, and of course here in our country as well. And if that threat to travel continues to have a palpable chilling effect on tourism, perhaps even on trade, then for a great trading nation like Britain, that is a matter of deep concern. And then there is an even more pernicious phenomenon, stemming, however unfairly, from the disastrous events in Iraq. And that is the temptation of governments to take this instability and insecurity, which we cannot deny, and use it as an excuse to move away from democracy. Across Africa, you can see for the first time in decades that governments are gradually becoming more authoritarian. The number of African countries rated free or partly free has fallen from 34 to 29 in the last 10 years. There are 4 African presidents who are currently rewriting their national constitutions to tighten their grip on power. And without going into details, since you all know them, I'm afraid there are plenty of countries, large and small, where the idea of multi-party representative democracy in which we believe is obstinately failing to catch on. And I think that is because there is also a view that has gained ground over the last few years that Fukuyama was wrong. I think you all know who I mean by Fukuyama. Why is that? That's right. Why, at the end of history. I'm just checking you are following there. There's a view gaining ground that Fukuyama was wrong and that there is no real symmetry in the golden coin that I described. And there's a cynical view gaining ground that you can have economic prosperity without political and social freedom. Indeed, there is a view now in many parts of the world that the only way to ensure prosperity and stability is to suppress freedom, to crack down on pesky NGOs and civil society and liquidate irritating journalists and compromise independent judges, and generally to deprecate the Western liberal consensus about how a society should be ordered. So if I have one message for you this afternoon, it is that this illiberal analysis is deeply and dangerously wrong. And these social, political freedoms, as well as economic freedoms, are not just, they're not inimical to prosperity, as our ideological opponents would say. They are, in fact, essential. It's the other way around. They are essential for sustained growth. And I can prove that point. I'm not going to make reference to the difficulties of other countries, but I think that would be wrong and undiplomatic. As I say, I'm going to prove that point by simply asking you to look, by contrast, at the society we live in, a 21st century Britain that incarnates that symmetry. Why have we got more tech wizards in London than any other place in Europe? Is it because we politicians decided to embark on a Soviet-style program of training people to do tech? Did it come from... I like to say it did. In fact, I used to claim that I invented the whole thing. On the contrary, nothing to do with me at all. I had no idea what it was. It all started... It was because London acquired a deserved reputation as being the greatest city on earth, a great jiving funkopolitan melting pot, where provided you did nothing to damage the interests of others, and provided you obeyed the law, you could make of your life pretty much what you wanted. And that, frankly, is why we lead in all those creative and cultural sectors, and that's why we have the best universities on earth. British University, Oxford, just named the best in the world again, because the best minds from across the world are meeting in some of the best pubs and bars and nightclubs. That's absolutely true, with the best cultural life anywhere on the planet. And they're like subatomic particles colliding in a cyclotron and producing those flashes of innovation that are essential for long-term economic success. And it will not surprise you to know that Britain is ranked amongst the top 3 most innovative places in the world. America's number 4, by the way. China I promised I wouldn't be competitive, but China is 25th. And indeed, to get back to my central point, the entire top 10 innovative societies in the world are free market liberal democracies. And it's because we have both those values at once together in this country, symmetrically, that we are still, according to the OECD, the fastest growing economy in Europe, with record unemployment and fantastic achievements of this government. And it is this new dynamic government, led by Theresa May, that is working not just to ensure that this country's success is felt by the few, but felt by absolutely everybody. And I think we should have no shame or embarrassment in championing those ideals and the symmetry in our thought around the world. And in this era of dithering and dubitation, the message of Global Britain should be that we stick up as vigorously for democracy and for human rights as we do for free markets. And when all is said and done, my friends, and I know this will not please absolutely everybody in the world, well, I don't know, it probably might please everybody in the world, but I'm going to try it anyway. I think that vote on June the 23rd, I think that was a vote for economic and political freedom, and freedom for this country. And it was a liberation. Over the last couple of months, I'm proud to say I've sat in all kinds of meetings. Jerry was pointing out vast, ruminative feasts of lunch or dinner in the castles of Mittel Europa, washed down with the finest wines known to man, and on one occasion a splendid breakfast that seemed to stretch from course after course from 8 o'clock to 11 o'clock, and I've enjoyed all of them, every course. And I've made friends, I've made alliances, I've struck up all sorts of relationships, had wonderful conversations in the various Euro creoles that I attempt to speak. But I have just to tell any lingering Gloomadon poppers here in this audience that never once have I felt in all my conversations in the European Council that this country would be in any way disadvantaged by extricating ourselves from the EU treaties. On the contrary, I think there are many ways in which we will be liberated. to be more active, more visible, more energetic on the world stage than ever before. Because as I never tire of telling you, we are not leaving Europe. We may be leaving the EU, we are not leaving Europe. We will remain committed to all kinds of European cooperation at an intergovernmental level, whether it is maintaining sanctions against Russia for what's going on in Ukraine or sending our navy to help the Italians with the migrant crisis in the central Mediterranean. But we will also be able to speak up in our own distinctive voice, leading the world as we now are in imposing a ban on ivory and helping to save the elephant, helping to save it in a way that the disunited EU, they can't come up with a position because some of them are slightly kowtowing to the big ivory importers. The disunited EU is unable to do. In fact, we have an absurd situation in which the EU is actually trying to veto the ivory ban in spite of having a president called Donald Tusk, ladies and gentlemen, which I think you will agree is an error. Or relaunching the cause of global, as Teresa just said in her terrific speech just now, relaunching the cause of global free trade that's been stalled since the failure of the Doha round. And I can think of a few more positive forces in the global economy, the world's fifth biggest economy, taking back control, not just of our democracy, taking back control of our borders and our cash, but also taking back control of our tariff schedules in Geneva, so that we can galvanize free trade, break the logjam, and, as Teresa has just rightly said, become the new global champions and agitators, and do free trade deals around the world that will continue the process of lifting billions of people out of poverty. And that is why the world needs global Britain and our values more than ever. A campaigner for what we believe in, a catalyst for change and reform and economic and political freedom in a world that is losing confidence in those values. And of course, there are some people who say we are too small, too feeble, too geopolitically reduced to have that kind of influence. And I think of the pogonologically challenged Labour Party, where they literally want to abolish our armed services and to keep our nuclear submarines as a kind of demented job creation programme, sending them to sea without any nukes aboard, so the whole nation is turned into a kind of glorified military capon, firing blanks. I'm not going to pretend. It's important to be realistic. I'm not going to pretend that this country is something that we are not. Every day I go to an office so vast that you could comfortably accommodate 3 squash courts, and so dripping with gilt bling that it looks like something out of the Kardashians. And I sit at the desk of George Nathaniel Curzon, and I sometimes reflect that this very seat I occupy was once the nerve centre of an empire that was 7 times the size of the Roman Empire at its greatest extent under Trajan, or was it Hadrian? I can't remember. And when I go into the map room of Palmerston, I can't help remembering that this country over the last 2 centuries has directed the invasion or conquest of 178 countries, that is most of the members of the UN, which is obviously not a point I majored on in New York at the UN General Assembly. And I didn't because those days are gone forever. And it is a profoundly good thing that they are gone. And yet it would be a fatal mistake now to underestimate what this country is doing or what it can do. Because in spite of Iraq, it is simply not the case that every military intervention has been a disaster. Look at what we did in Sierra Leone, look at Somalia, where my predecessor, William Hague, helped initiate a bold program to tackle the pirates that plagued the coast of that country, and together with a coalition of other European countries of the kind that we will continue to be involved in the future, British ships took them on with all the courage and decisiveness of our 19th century forebears. And what was the result? Before the anti-pirate campaign, the pirates had cost the world economy about $7 billion a year. When Britain stepped in, the attacks stopped altogether. In fact, I'm glad to say that since 2012, there have been more Hollywood films about Somali pirates starring Tom Hanks than there have been pirate attacks. In fact, there have been 5 films and no pirate attacks. So that's Global Britain 5, Pirates 0. Of course, we don't... We don't want to wield our hard power, and we think an age before we do. But when we give our armed services clear and achievable missions, they can be remarkably effective. And with 2% of our GDP spent on defence, we will be the leading military player in Western Europe for the foreseeable future. And our hard power is dwarfed by a phenomenon that the pessimists never predicted when we unbundled the British Empire. And that is, of course, our soft power. The vast, subtle, pervasive extension of British influence around the world that goes with having the language that was invented and perfected in this country, it's ours, and now has more speakers than any other language on earth. Up the creeks and inlets of all the continents of the world go the gentle gunboats of British soft power, skippered by the likes of Jeremy Clarkson, a prophet more honoured abroad, alas, than in his own country, or J.K. Rowling, who is worshipped by young people in some Asian countries as a kind of divinity, or just the BBC. And no matter how infuriating and shamelessly anti-Brexit they sometimes can be, I think the Beeb is the single greatest and most effective ambassador for our culture and our values. And it was Sergei Lavrov himself who told me that he had not only watched our version of War and Peace, but thought it was very well done. And that, from the Kremlin, I think, was praise. If you want final proof of our irresistible soft power, I remind you, as I always do, that this country not only invented and codified just about every sport or game known to humanity, but this year, it was our athletes from a country that can boast less than 1% of the world's population that came second in the Olympic and Paralympic Games. And I hope all our friends in Beijing will not mind if I point out that their teams had 1.4 billion people to draw on. Now, look, to wind up, my friends, yes, it is true, as I have said, that the world is not as safe or as healthy as it should be. And it is true that in 2016 we are worryingly afflicted by war and terrorism and the new perils of cybercrime, and by the painful refusal of many parts of the world to accept what you and I might see as common sense, that free markets and free societies go together. But in case you are remotely tempted to despair, I urge you not to look at the problems, but look at the successes that these free institutions have helped to engender. For all its difficulties, life expectancy in Africa has risen astonishingly as that country has entered the global economic system. In 2000, the average Ethiopian lived, 16 years ago, the average Ethiopian lived to only 47. It's now 64 and climbing. In Zambia, the increase has been from 44 years to 60 years old. In 1990, 37% of the world's population lived in poverty, and that is now down, in absolute poverty. That is now down to only 9.6% today. And I think we, with our commitment to 0.7% of our GDP going on development aid, can take a large share of the credit for that achievement. And I pay tribute to what Priti and her team are doing. £300 million a year to Ethiopia alone. I believe it is worth it. I believe that it is our duty to do it. But above all, it is our economic ideas, our beliefs in freedom, our values that continue to lift the world out of poverty. And that's got to be our continued ambition. Now, it's been an extraordinary experience for me to be Foreign Secretary for the last few months, and together with my fantastic team of ministerial colleagues, Sir Alan Duncan for Europe and the Americas, Joyce Lanalay for the Commonwealth and the UN, Tobias Elwood for Africa and the Middle East, Alok Sharma for Asia and the Pacific. We've made literally hundreds of trips, cats cradling the world in a truly stupefying accumulation of air miles. Not that we can claim them, of course. No, seriously, be in no doubt. And I have confirmed to myself, by primary observation, that we have in our Foreign Office, our Foreign and Commonwealth Office, we have the finest diplomatic service in the world, covering more countries than the French, with only 70% of their budget, by the way, just a point the Treasury might note. And I'm giving nothing away when I say we have the most superb intelligence agencies in the world. When I make a speech, finally, in a foreign city, I look around the heaving room, and I become aware of a phenomenon I think people in this country are barely aware of, and that is that of the Brits now alive and born in this country, fully 1 in 10 is now living abroad. So we're talking about a population of 5 or 6 million, the size of Scotland, bigger. No other rich country, according to the World Bank, has a diaspora on that scale. No other, never mind immigration, which I'm in favour of, by the way, no other country is such a formidable exporter of human talent. Business people, lawyers, teachers, prospectors, adventurers, poets, painters, whiskey sellers, French knicker sellers, by the way, which we sell in ever-growing quantities to France, and will continue to do, when we strike a deal in a Europe that works for everyone. No other country is turned so tangibly, physically outwards and into the world. And what these 5 million Brits take with them, not just a knowledge of English or the cast of the Archers or which kind of game has a position called silly mid-off or what's the difference in ant and deck, about which I wouldn't necessarily want to be interrogated myself. They take an instinctive set of values. And whether they are retired teachers working as monitors in the Ukrainian war zone, the kind I met a couple of weeks ago, or Met police officers training their counterparts in the parts of Syria held by the moderate opposition, I find that these Brits are respected and admired in sometimes unexpected ways by ordinary people around the world. And in an age of anxiety and uncertainty, it is surely more obvious than ever that our values are needed. And though we can never be complacent, I think we never take our position for granted. I think Winston Churchill was absolutely right. He was bound to come up. Why not now? I think Winston Churchill was absolutely right when he said that the empires of the future will be empires of the mind. And in expressing our values abroad, I believe that global Britain is a soft power superpower. And I think that we can be immensely proud of what we're achieving and what we will go on to achieve in the years ahead. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
We will make America great again.